All right, we're done with the part of the unit that deals with ecoecology, and now we're going to get into photosynthesis and cellular respiration and fermentation. But we need to go over some things just to make sure that you are up on the vocabulary. So you'll notice that this slide is referred to as review. So these are all the things that you should, all the terminology and concepts that you should be very familiar with by this point. And if you're not, then you need to review it. So other than matter, and remember when we say matter, we're talking about the elements that make up living things. So oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus. Living things, of course, need energy. And that's what metabolism is all about, matter and energy. And that's what we're studying in this unit, metabolism. It's all about matter and energy. Here we're focusing primarily on energy. So energy for our chemoheterotrophic life, when I say our, I'm talking about all us consumers, comes from the chemical energy in food. So we digest food, we use the energy from the food, we use the matter from the food to build our bodies. That's what makes us chemoheterotrophs. The energy in food ultimately comes from the sun. And just recall that the sun, the light from the sun, is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is very broad. A very narrow part of that spectrum is visible. So the visible spectrum is what photosynthetic organisms are using. Just the light that we can also see. So they use the same light that we can see, the same part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And they do this through photosynthesis. Photosynthetic organisms include cyanobacteria, algae, which, if you'll recall, are protists, the unit that we just studied, and plants, a unit that we're going to study in the future. But these are all photosynthetic, using light from the visible spectrum to make their own food. Chemosynthesis, and don't forget about chemosynthesis, is used by certain prokaryotes, bacteria, right? When you think prokaryote, think bacteria, and vice versa, to make food, glucose, just like photosynthetic organisms are making glucose, using chemical energy instead of electromagnetic radiation, or instead of light from the visible spectrum, to make simple inorganic compounds, so compounds that don't contain carbon, like hydrogen sulfide. And that's the primary example that we're looking at, but there are a myriad of other inorganic compounds, simple inorganic compounds that chemosynthetic organisms are using to obtain energy for chemosynthesis, to make their own food. These organisms that make their own food do it by carbon fixation, which is an anabolic process, if you'll recall. Anabolic referring to that half of metabolism that builds things. And so inorganic carbon in the form of carbon dioxide is taken from the air or from the surrounding environment, if it's an aquatic environment, so the air or the water, and that's incorporated into glucose. And that process is known as carbon fixation, whether it be in photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Both those forms of autotrophic organisms are fixing carbon. So these are photochemoautotrophs, photoautotrophs or chemoautotrophs, self-feeding, and they're the ones that are producers. Photoautotrophs being the producers here on the surface, and chemoautotrophs being the producers either on the bottom of the ocean where there is no light, or deep in the Earth's crust where there is no light. And then, of course, the flip side of producers are the consumers, so organisms that have to digest others, which is digestion being a catabolic process, if you'll recall, that half of metabolism that breaks things down. So we and other consumers digest other organisms for energy and carbon, so that makes us chemoheterotrophs, other feeding, and our consumers. So that's a rundown of all the terminology involved, and I hope you feel comfortable with it. So how's energy handled within the cell? Once we have the energy captured by either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, then where does it go? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the different kinds of energy that there is. And we can divide it into two categories: kinetic energy, and hopefully you recognize that from previous science classes as the energy of motion. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Radiant energy is considered kinetic. Mechanical energy, of course, mechanical, that kind of gives you the idea that something's moving, right? So that's kinetic. Electrical is the movement of electrons. That's kinetic. Thermal is the production of sound waves through the air, and that's movement. That's kinetic. I'm sorry. Not thermal. Thermal is heat. And that's kinetic. That's considered kinetic. And sound. That's what I was talking about. Sound waves moving through the air, right? Moving, kinetic energy. Oh, and thermal's considered kinetic energy because when substance increases in temperature, the molecules are moving faster and faster. The higher the temperature, the faster they move. So it is kinetic energy. And when you're taking the temperature of something, you're actually measuring that kinetic energy. The other type of energy is potential energy, and there can be chemical potential energy. That's the kind of energy that is in glucose and the molecules that are made through the process of photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, like what we're going to be looking at here, ATP. So it's a form of chemical energy. Nuclear energy, the energy that's stored within every atom, and that's what nuclear power plants are releasing and using. Gravitational energy, of course, if you lift something up high in the air and drop it, you're releasing the potential energy. When it's high in the air, it has potential energy, and when you let go of it, it is releasing that potential energy as it falls to the ground. But that's gravitational potential energy. And then, of course, elastic. And so that would be like a spring, a coiled spring, or a stretched rubber band has potential energy. So we're actually going to kind of come back to that as kind of an analogy to how ATP here stores and releases its energy. But it's primarily chemical potential energy is what we're going to be looking at primarily, and how it is transferred and used within the cell. The other thing that's crucial to understand with any discussion of energy is what's known as the first law of thermodynamics. And the first law of thermodynamics states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Now, I recently was grading an ed puzzle concerning photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, and a lot of people were stating that both these processes create energy or produce energy, and that's not the way to think about it. That would signify that you have a misconception about the energy that is being captured and actually transformed or transferred, because that's really what's going on. So it's improper to say that photosynthesis or chemosynthesis is creating energy or producing energy. The better way to say it is that it's capturing the energy and transforming that energy and or transferring that energy from one chemical source to another, for example. So when you're going from one type of energy to another, like light to chemical, that's transformation. But when you're just transferring, like in chemosynthesis, it's just using the chemical energy to produce, or to, I'm sorry, I just used the wrong word. Using that chemical energy or transferring the chemical energy to another chemical like glucose. So that would be an example of transference. So be careful there. Energy can never be created or destroyed. That's the first law of thermodynamics. It's suggesting that it's very fundamental. So always remember that and never forget it. So all of that is leading into taking a look at what we have here on this slide, and that's adenosine triphosphate, ATP. It's an organic compound, of course, contains carbon, and it's composed of adenine, ribose, and 3 phosphate groups. So adenine, ribose, which is a sugar, right? Adenine is a nitrogenous base, if you'll recall, along with thymine and guanine and cytosine and uracil, and nucleic acids. Ribose is the 5-carbon sugar that we find in RNA, right? That's the R in RNA is ribonucleic acid. And then 3 phosphate groups. And that's the triphosphate. So adenine and ribose together are adenosine, known as adenosine. And then there are 3 phosphates on adenosine. Therefore, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So as I already stated, adenine is a nitrogenous base, like you find in DNA and RNA, and ribose is a 5-carbon sugar that you find in RNA, and along with phosphate, that's what you find in nucleic acids. But in nucleic acids, a nucleotide, for example, only has 1 phosphate. So if this didn't have 2 phosphates on it and it was incorporated into a nucleic acid, it would be considered a nucleotide. Hopefully you recognize that. And basically what ATP is an adenine ribonucleotide. Remember, the nucleotides found in DNA are known as deoxynucleotides, and the ones that are found in RNA are known as ribonucleotides. I'm sorry, the ones in DNA are deoxyribonucleotides, and the ones in RNA are ribonucleotides. So again, basically what ATP is an adenine ribonucleotide with simply 2 more phosphates. But that's where it gets its potential energy. And before we leave this slide, I just want to come back to this analogy where glucose is a much larger complex molecule, and it stores a greater amount of energy, potential chemical energy, than ATP does. So you can think of glucose as being worth about $100. It's like a $100 bill. And ATP is the result of making change from that $100 bill. That's what the process of aerobic cellular respiration does. It breaks down glucose and takes the chemical energy from glucose and transfers it into ATP. Not transforms it, because we're going from chemical energy to chemical energy, but it transfers it to ATP. Now, it's not a 100% efficient process, so energy is lost. And we'll come back to that idea when we talk about the efficiency of the process of aerobic cellular respiration. But ATP you can think of just as little packets of energy, whereas glucose is a larger packet of energy, a way to store a larger amount of energy, and ATP is a way to transfer that energy around. It's we call it the energy currency of cells because it's used like money. And that's the analogy that I'm making here, currency, like money, to distribute energy in the cell and make it available for cellular work where cellular work needs to be done. That's what ATP does. And finally, I just wanted to show you this animation that I found showing the actual space-filling model, what we call a space-filling model of ATP. And so it's rotating it and showing you that it is a 3-dimensional molecule that has adenine and ribose and phosphate groups, 3 phosphate groups. So that's the molecular structure of ATP. It's the phosphate groups that are the important part of ATP. Nothing else about the molecule changes as it's being used as the energy currency of cells and to do cellular work. But the phosphate, and only 1 phosphate, changes as we go from what's known as ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So adenosine diphosphate only has 2 phosphates instead of 3, diphosphate. ADP becomes ATP by adding a 3rd phosphate. So we can, and what cells do is recycle ADP to ATP, or recharge ADP to ATP. So whenever ATP is used, it becomes ADP, and then ADP can be recharged back into ATP simply by adding a 3rd phosphate to go from adenosine diphosphate to adenosine triphosphate. Now, it takes a lot of energy to do that. It takes a lot of energy to force a phosphate onto this molecule that already has 2 phosphates, because phosphate groups have a negative charge. Phosphate is PO4 -3. So it's got a -3 negative charge, and to cram all that negative charge together takes a lot of energy. And it also, you can think of this like a coiled spring, potential energy, like a spring that's been compressed. This thing wants to spring apart. And so that's representing a lot of chemical potential energy there. And it's an endergonic reaction. Now, hopefully you recall, because we went over endergonic reactions back when we were looking at reactions and enzymes, enzyme catalyzed reactions. So energy's going into this reaction. That's what makes it endergonic. Endergonic reactions require energy, absorb energy, whereas the opposite, exergonic reactions, release energy. So this is endergonic. Energy has to go in order to add that third phosphate onto ADP. So where does that energy come from? Well, it comes from light. If we're talking about photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis uses light energy to turn ADP into ATP. Chemosynthetic organisms are doing the same thing, but they're using chemical energy to turn ADP into ATP. And then aerobic cellular respiration is using the chemical energy from glucose, and so does fermentation, using the chemical energy in glucose and using that to transform ADP into ATP. So the analogy here is that it's like a rechargeable battery, obviously, where ADP is partially charged and ATP is fully charged. Now, we must note that the phosphate group, this phosphate group, has a lowercase I, and you may be wondering why, and for some reason your textbook never even explains it. And that's because it's considered inorganic phosphate, because it's no longer attached to an organic compound. ADP and ATP contain carbon. They are carbon-containing compounds. They're organic compounds. And when the phosphate is attached, it would be considered organic phosphate. But a phosphate that has been freed from ATP and is all by itself, it doesn't contain any carbon, therefore it's inorganic. So that's what that little I stands for, and I just wanted to make sure you understood since it was there. So hopefully you can see that this reaction represents the opposite of what we saw on the previous slide. On the previous slide, we were adding a phosphate onto ADP to make ATP, and here we're transferring, we're removing a phosphate so that we're making ADP from ATP. In other words, ATP is going to become ADP when it loses its third phosphate, right? So it's the opposite of what we just saw on the previous slide. The chemical bond between the second and third phosphate is broken. And I made that all bold because that's the important part of the ATP molecule. ATP gives up its chemical energy by breaking that bond between the second and third phosphate. So that's an important bond. That's the most important bond in ATP, the bond between the second and third phosphate. Notice the flash here. When the bond is broken, they included a flash in the diagram, and whenever you see that kind of flash, it's going to have something to do with energy. So in this case, what they're suggesting is that when that bond is broken, energy is released. So it's an exergonic reaction, opposite of endergonic, right? It's an exergonic reaction. It's an endergonic reaction to recharge ADP to ATP, but it's an exergonic reaction to release the energy from ATP and bring it back to ADP. So the energy that's released is what's used to do cellular work. That energy is what's available then to do cellular work. And all the rest of this, I know this looks like a lot. I just wanted to give you a lot of examples of what we mean by cellular work. There's transport work to be done, like active transport. And remember, active transport is called active transport because it requires cellular energy. It requires ATP, if you'll recall from back when we were studying transport across plasma membranes. Vesicular transport, remember vesicles can move around inside cells, and they are moved around inside cells. Remember, they can travel along mitochondria like railroad tracks. So that's what we're talking about there, vesicular transport, vesicles within the cytoplasm. Locomotion work, we just studied protists, and some of them have cilia, and some of them have flagella, and some of them have pseudopodia, and all that takes energy, and that ATP is where that energy comes from, locomotion. Also, muscle contraction. When you move your body, ATP is the reason that your muscles are able to contract. There are two proteins in your muscles, actin and myosin, that interact with each other using ATP in order to cause your muscles to contract and shorten, and therefore you're able to move. There are all kinds of anabolic processes, like replicating DNA, transcribing RNA. Remember, anabolic is putting things together. So, replicating DNA, we're building DNA, and transcribing RNA, we're building RNA and translating proteins, and all of it requires ATP, even though that when we were studying that, we didn't see ATP in any of the diagrams or anything. But I'm telling you now, it requires ATP in order to carry out these processes. And thousands of other enzyme-catalyzed endergonic reactions. Any reaction, any cellular reaction or cellular work that needs to be done is carried out using ATP. So these could be either anabolic or catabolic, because it can require energy to break things down too. So catabolic processes can require ATP just like anabolic processes do. Any endergonic reaction. All right, so in this diagram they show the flash, and that's representing energy, but it's kind of an oversimplification the way they're presenting it here. And when you go on in biology, you're going to learn that it is an oversimplification, because what's really going on here is not that energy is being released and it's just kind of in the environment, able to be picked up by another reaction and used by an endergonic reaction. That's not exactly what's going on. What's going on is actually the transfer of the third phosphate. So when that bond is broken, that third phosphate is being transferred to another compound. So another compound is receiving that phosphate, and in the process, that transfers energy to that other compound. And when a phosphate is transferred from ATP onto another compound, we call that phosphorylation. So the way that energy is transferred, the way that ATP gives up its energy is by giving up a phosphate to another compound, phosphorylating another compound. That other compound then has more chemical energy, and it is able to then participate in an endergonic reaction. So that's really what's going on when ATP, the energy of ATP, is used to do work, cellular work, phosphorylation. So finally, what was alluded to previously, we can go from ADP to ATP and from ATP to ADP, and that suggests that there's an ATP-ADP cycle. So that's what we're looking at here. We also see that through this cycle, and really the function of ATP is to couple, as we say, exergonic reactions to endergonic reactions, and that's referred to as energy coupling. So cells usually only have a small amount of ATP because it's constantly being used and charged. So it's constantly going through this cycle, ADP to ATP. The energy shown on the right comes from light, or chemicals, or food. So hopefully when you see these now, you think to yourself, light, photosynthesis, chemicals, chemosynthesis, food, aerobic cellular respiration, or fermentation, hopefully. So notice here I have in parentheses arrows, so the energy coupling is being represented by the arrows. Light, chemicals, photosynthesis, chemosynthesis, aerobic cellular respiration, or fermentation, those are exergonic reactions. So we have energy from exergonic reactions, that's this energy. And then the flash on the left represents energy transferred by phosphorylation. Remember, phosphorylation is how ATP actually gives up its energy, right? So the exergonic reactions, the energy is being used to add an inorganic phosphate to ADP to make ATP. ATP then is used to do cellular work, and it gives up its energy by phosphorylation, by transferring that third phosphate onto another compound. And that's how that cellular work is performed. But the arrows here represent the coupling, the energy coupling. The function of ATP is to couple energy from exergonic reactions to to cellular work, and the endergonic reactions of cellular work. And we refer to that as energy coupling. And that's really kind of the overall function of ATP. It's kind of the middleman between exergonic reactions and endergonic reactions. Exergonic reactions where the energy comes from, and endergonic reactions where the energy is needed in order to keep living things living. So this is a cycle, but it's important to note that it's a cycle between ATP and ADP. It's not a cycle, an energy cycle, right? It's a cycle that involves energy, but it's not an energy cycle because energy does not cycle. Always remember and never forget, energy flows and matter cycles. Matter cycles, that's the biogeochemical cycles that we've studied. But energy flows, and that's what the arrows are representing here. Energy is flowing through the ATP, ADP cycle. It's not cycling through, it's flowing through.